Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good to have you all here today, back with us. Let's go push this button quick. Cool. Yeah, good to have you back with us. Like I said right before the recording started, thanks for bearing with me while I was getting some technology stuff figured out. We might have a brief little pause in the middle here once the TV gets here so we can play a video for you guys at the end today.
It's on that table on the end there.
Yes, it is. All right.
Well, that works.
That was the first thing that we had figured out today. That's awesome. We got it. Cool. Yeah, super excited to have you all back today. This week and next week, just as kind of a heads up, they're going to be a little bit dense. And so what I've tried to do is at the very end, like the end of this week, we're going to have a video that is sort of the why should I care part of the lesson. So if you're going through this and you're like, this is all way above me and, this seems way too ethereal and I just don't know that I care, just hang on to it until the very end. And I promise there's something really cool that'll come out of it at the end, both this week and next week. And then the week after that, I believe. Yeah, so week 6 is when we get into free will. Do we have free will? And that's a question that everybody loves to talk about. So that'll be a fun one that's a little bit more down to earth. But before we get there, we have a couple of places we need to go. And so today we are going to be talking about what is primarily called metaphysics, and I'll explain what that means, and ontology as well. And again, those are big words. You don't have to worry a ton about them right now. But yeah, I just wanted to give you a little encouragement there where if it feels like it's going really, really deep, it's okay. It's all right. That is natural. It's supposed to feel like that. Give me just 1 second. Yes, ma'am? No, there should be just a regular cord there. So there's not an extra cable that's just sitting there? Was there one on the TV? Yeah. Okay, well, just go ahead and leave it where it's at, and I'm gonna get going. I'm talking on the phone while things are recording. Okay. All right. So apologies again.
To let our brains bleed.
No, it's not gonna bleed.
My ears is coming out my ears.
Yeah. So just found out that the video, we're gonna have to do it small wise on my computer, but I'll have it set up here. I'll turn it up really loud. Yeah. That would be bad for what we're gonna do.
Like Snoopy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we'll get to it. It'll be okay. The most important thing is that you can hear it, and there's some cool kind of visuals that go with it. And again, if you want to see it later on a bigger screen, you can go watch the recording online. That's usually up tomorrow morning. So we'll have it. It'll be available. It's all gonna be all right. Things are gonna work out. Let's spend just a brief moment in prayer together, and then we'll dive in for this evening. Lord Jesus, we give you the time this evening. We ask that you shape us and form us and instruct us in the way that we can be better thinkers. And Lord, I want to take just a moment right now, for me especially, to just breathe and collect ourselves and prepare to engage critically in a different way of thinking. Lord, I thank you for the mental capabilities to reason, to think really hard, and to see how it all works together in the world. Lord, we love you. We give this time to you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So like I said before, I had a phone call that was really important. Today we are talking about metaphysics. We're talking about ontology. And again, if you go through the whole time that we're here, and you're like, this is my I don't until the end. Because there's a video at the end that is going to be like, if you don't understand anything about any of this metaphysics or ontology stuff, this is the payout. This is where it matters. Thank you, Mia. So let's talk briefly, and by briefly I mean for the next hour. What is metaphysics? Just your common, average, everyday Wednesday afternoon discussion. 2 Corinthians 4:18, relating to metaphysics, says, "What can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal." In addition, Aristotle, in his book titled Metaphysics, wrote, "Since we are seeking this knowledge, we must inquire of what kind are the causes and the principles, the knowledge of which is wisdom." And if those don't do it for you, then the very last quote by William Jefferson Clinton said, and I think this is one of the best statements of metaphysics, that all depends on what the meaning of is. And so this is the kind of discussion that we are going to be engaged in today. So we start with the question, what is metaphysics? Well, metaphysics is a great word that we get to derive directly from the Greek. And fortunately for you, because I've taken Greek, we get to break this down just a little bit. So the Greek word meta is just a preposition. It usually means after. It can also mean among or with, but in this case it means after because of the noun that it's paired with. And then the word physis is the Greek word for nature or things occurring naturally. So like if you were to go outside and look at the trees and the birds, the Greeks would have called that physis. It's nature, it's natural. And so metaphysis or metaphysics has literally been translated as the things after physics, or after the physical world. Literally, it's just the idea that there are some things outside of the physical world. There are questions that we can ask that get to things outside of the physical world, and the study of metaphysics deals with things that lay outside of what we can define with just strict empiricism. And empiricism is another word that you're going to hear come up a little bit later, but empiricism is basically, can I define things with my senses? Is this something I can touch, that I can see, that I can hear? You'll hear scientists, when they're asking for data, they usually say, show me empirical data. It's data that is like quantifiable, that I can, that I can do something with. But metaphysics has a tendency to deal with things that are outside of the empirical realm. Now, just as a brief overview, metaphysics has kind of gotten a bad rap, especially in the recent half century or so, because it got tied into like a new age idea where, in the new age spirituality, people were talking about the metaphysical realm, and that usually got tied somehow into a spiritual realm that they were talking with. And so it got a bad rap for people that were thinking, because they're like, oh, that's just that new age stuff with crystals and all that. We don't need to deal with any of that. But metaphysics actually dates back, the questions and the ideas that metaphysics deals with dates back to the time even before Aristotle. These questions have been being asked, but Aristotle was really the first one in his work. The book called Metaphysics was really the first one to be deemed in this way. Metaphysics also are actually really helpful in talking about Christian creeds, and some of the very earliest Christian creeds are filled with metaphysical terms. So words like person or essence or substance, or a really fun one, subsistence. You don't have to worry about that word. But those kind of early Christian words that were used to talk about things like the dual natures of Christ being both human and divine, or how God exists as a Trinity, 3 persons in one substance. If you've ever looked at the Trinity, we might look at that a little bit later in this class, but these are all questions of ontology, and they deal with what is a person, what is an essence, what does it mean to have substance, or what is substance, what does it mean to subsist, what does it mean to exist in a certain way. So this is not just some high and lofty thing that philosophers deal with. Like, this is actually incredibly important to an understanding of the Christian worldview. Now, like all things that we've talked about in this class up to this point, a strict definition of metaphysics is extremely difficult to define completely. And if you're ever in philosophy and you're like, I have a great strict definition of something that we can define, people are probably going to be like, no, you don't, because it's philosophy. But just know that metaphysics is difficult to define completely. But for our purposes and for just getting a general grasp of it, you can understand metaphysics as the study of nature of being or reality, like how do things exist or why do things exist. This is also the study of categories or the kinds of things that are real. So what does it mean for something to be real and what does it mean for it to be not real? So for example, some questions that metaphysics might ask is, what is the difference between existing and not existing? Is reality one or is reality many? Are there one realities or are there many realities? Are there abstract objects that exist? So things like numbers that are real, they exist, but they're not spatial. They don't take up any space and they're not temporal. They're not affected by time at all. Do those kind of objects exist somewhere? And if they do, where are they? Then you start getting into questions of like, are we free or determined? You can ask the question, is matter real? And if so, what is it? Do humans have minds as well as bodies? Is the property of being read real? And if so, what is that? So these are the kind of metaphysics questions that people ask. Now, maybe to help get at this in a slightly different way, the Catholic philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, back in, I want to say the 1400s is when he finished the Summa. He wrote this big systematic theology where he started from the most basic and then moved into different areas that built on what he had already started with. And in one of his articles that he wrote inside of this, he talks about, philosophers had this understanding and it took them a really long time to get to this idea of metaphysics. And so it can be helpful for us in thinking about this and in thinking about the kind of questions that we're going to ask, to think about how naturally these questions sort of progressed. And so as people grew up over the years and as we, changed and started thinking about things differently, people started asking questions as they looked at themselves and maybe somebody who looked slightly different from them, and they would say, okay, that seems to be a human being, but why is that human being? Maybe you're looking at me specifically and you're like, why is this human being white in color? Like, why is this human being existing in this specific way? Why is he white? But then they started getting down into a deeper question than even just that. And they started saying, okay, the question of why this human being exists in this certain way is one thing, but what makes this human being different from the cabinet? Or what makes this human being different from the door? And if both things exist, how are they different from each other? And then that drove them to ask even one more further question. And the further question is, why is this thing here? Is this thing here? Is it real? Does it exist in some way? And again, if it does exist, how does it exist differently from the other things that also exist? And so it's these progression of questions. Why do things exist in this specific way or as such? Why do things exist like in a different way than other things exist? And why does this thing exist? Just period. And so you can kind of see the progression of thought. And with Aquinas's thinking, it sort of goes from like a shallower to a deeper line of thinking. And Aquinas would argue that the deeper the question you ask, the deeper the answer you're going to get, which sort of makes sense. So let's do a little bit of a practical exercise with this. I'm going to take my book over here. So Mia so graciously wrote 5 sentences on the board for me that you can read because they're not in my handwriting.
Thank you, Mia.
Thank you very much, Mia. So because metaphysics is the study of being or of reality, let's consider these 5 sentences and see, is there something that these can tell us maybe about how we're thinking about being? And so each of these sentences uses a different variation or a different meaning of the word is, right? So part of metaphysical investigating and part of metaphysical thinking is distinguishing these different sentences and saying something helpful about each of them. And that makes sense, right? We want to be able to say, like, yeah, these are distinctly, even if it's. So, for example, the very first sentence, Michael is real. Boy, I hope I am. But this first sentence, it is a statement about being or existence. It asserts that I, personally here, that I exist. And so this sense of to be and this use of the word is raises this question of what does it mean to exist or not to exist, and what is it about something that accounts for my existence? Like if I am real, what is it that accounts for my existence being here?
What is it?
Well, we'll get there.
I don't understand.
That's okay. Again, we're trying to just parse these things out a little bit right now. So the second statement, let's compare it. So this first one again is a statement of being or existence, like this thing actually is. The second one, Michael is the teacher of the class, this class specifically. So this sentence uses the word is as a statement of identity. It's saying that Michael is in some way identical to or equated with the teacher of this class. It's the class, technically. So this raises questions in metaphysics of what does it mean for something to be some kind of thing, X being Michael, and also be some kind of thing, Y being the teacher? How are these two things related to each other? What is it for something to be identical to itself? So me being the teacher, but different from being the chair. What is it for those things to be different? Let's also compare that to sentence number 3. So sentence number 3 says Michael is human. Sentence number 3 employs an is of what is called essential predication. And so a predicate is something that is usually like placed upon the noun that comes before it. This is getting super deep into English grammar. And I only know English grammar because I took Hebrew and then Greek, which it doesn't speak very well for my English education. But the point is that this thing is usually predicated upon, or it's usually describing in some way the noun that comes before it. What this is saying, what this statement is saying with its is, it's saying that being human is somehow the very essence, or it's like the internal nature of Michael. So Michael is human is saying that his essence or his nature is somehow human-ish. And so this raises questions of what does it mean to say that something is the essence of something else? So what does it mean to say that being human is the essence of this? Do things have essences? And if so, what are they? Again, big questions. Sentence number 4, Michael is white, is a question of what is called accidental predication. So here we have essential predication, right, where this thing is clarifying this thing in a way that seems to be very essential, right? I am essentially human, like I couldn't have been otherwise and still be Michael. However, Michael is white is sort of a question of accidental predication. It says that I have a property, and this property of whiteness is somehow present in me. Or I exhibit this property. And it raises the question of whether properties exist, and if so, what are they? It also raises questions of is a character trait of something that is able to, help describe the noun that comes before it. Is this defining trait, is it somehow like essential to the thing that it describes, or is this somehow dissociated, or is it the philosophical term, excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied. The philosophical term accidental doesn't mean like, oh, it just happened by accident, but it means it could have been different without changing the essence or the very nature of the thing itself. So it doesn't mean like, oops, somebody spilled. It just means like it's not a defining feature of what it means to be human, for example. And so the very last one, the very last sentence, uses an is of constitution, or what is sometimes called a part and a whole. It describes the parts that something is made up of, what constitutes, what makes it up. And so this statement, Michael is skin and bone, is saying that I have these parts being both skin externally, which you can see, and internally bone, which hopefully you can see.
On rare occasions.
On rare, yeah, you don't want to see those. But this raises questions of whether parts are different from properties. So is skin and bone the same thing as light somehow? Or is there some kind of similarity between the two? The other question is, can something lose parts and still be the same thing? And if it does lose enough parts, does it become something different? And so it's this question of being, and being in these different ways that are sort of described. And so as the quote said at the very beginning of class, it really depends on what the definition of is when you're thinking ontologically. So now that everybody is sufficiently confused. First off, are there any questions on that somebody needs clarifications for? I know that I raised a lot of questions right there, and you're like, I want the answers to those, and we could spend days talking about just one of them and being like, well, this is how this defines as this thing, this is how this defines as this thing. And again, like lots and lots of books have been written about these topics specifically that says, you know, if sentence number 2 is an identity, what does it mean for something to have an identity, and how does that differ from it being? Is something being the same thing as its identity? So again, there's a lot to it. It gets really deep. I don't want to take us that deep into it, but it's helpful to see that this is sort of the area that we're dealing with. So I asked for questions and then kept talking. Does anybody have questions? If not, it's okay. Awesome. So let's look at the two main areas that metaphysics is normally broken up into. Now, metaphysics is normally broken up into these two categories specifically. They're typically designated as a general ontology and special metaphysics. And again, these are really big words that are really just talking about the study of things being. How do things be? A general ontology, it's generally the most basic aspect of metaphysics. And when people are talking about, you know, being or existing or things like that, they're a lot of times talking about a general ontology until you get into special cases, and we'll get there in just a second. But a general ontology has 3 main tasks. And its 3 main tasks are, 1, it focuses on the nature of existence itself. What does it mean for something to exist? The second main task that it has is it lays out general principles of being and features that are true of all things. So again, the example of if I exist and if the door exists, what is it that makes us similar enough that we both can say that we exist, but different enough that we say that we exist differently? Or the popular thing that people like to bring up a lot is, you know, we're stardust, right? We're made up of star atoms. Maybe you've heard that before, but when atoms explode, they let out different molecules and stuff, and we're like 70 or 80, it might even be higher than that, where a certain percentage of our body is made up of nothing but carbon, right? But we also know that like coal is nothing but condensed carbon. And so if we both are made up of mostly carbon, what is it about carbon that makes us exist? And what is it about us existing that has us exist differently? Why are we not just lumps of coal that can somehow think and rationalize? That would be weird. So this, yeah. But so a general ontology will ask questions of general principles of being, features that are true of all things. And then the third task of ontology, and this is a really big one because this is something that it can be really helpful in trying to figure it out, but it can also get really confusing. The third main task of ontology is what's called categorical analysis. So it's splitting things up into categories, and it's saying, okay, if these things exist, it seems like these things exist in some way, and these exist in some way, and they exist similarly. And so let's put these in a category over here. Let's put these in a category over here and see if that tells us something about the way that they exist, right? It's like putting things into different groups. Now, one quick word about categorical analysis before we do a little bit of categorical thinking ourselves. There was a big debate many years ago, and it's still kind of ongoing depending on who you follow, about categories. There have been various opinions. There are kind of 2 main ones, though. And the 2 main opinions that are set out are were provided first by Aristotle, who believed that there were 10 basic categories of reality. I'll go over those in just a second. And then, Emmanuel, who said that the categories that you can divide things into, they're not really divisions of the world, but rather they express the divisions of the world as they appear to us as knowing subjects. And so the world really isn't divided. We just, as knowing subjects, split them up differently. And so it's sort of this question that we were asking ourselves last week, is reality dependent upon the observer, or is reality somehow independent of the observer? How can we split those two things apart? And so Aristotle argued that reality is basically 10 different categories. And the categories that he argued that you could split things into were substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, posture, state, action, and passivity. And again, so if we think about, I'm picking on chairs today. Let's pick on the chair. So if we think about the chair, for example, we would be able to talk about the chair in terms of its substance, right? What is it made up of? We'd be able to talk about it in terms of quantity. How many chair is there, or how many chairs are there? We'd be able to talk about that. We'd be able to talk about the quality. Is this chair good quality? Is it bad quality? Does it stand up? Does it not stand up? We'd be able to talk about it in relation. The chair is to the right of me. In place, the chair is located in 209 Great House, Nashville, Tennessee, at First Church of the Nazarene. We'd be able to talk about time. The chair exists at this specific time, and it has existed for this duration of time. Its posture, its state, its action, its passivity. Is it doing anything? Is it receiving any actions? So the chairs that you're sitting in right now are receiving action from you, receiving the action of sitting, which is fun to think about. And so Aristotle broke the world up in that way. And I spend time with Aristotle specifically because generally for looking at things through a Christian theology and through a Christian worldview, it makes more sense and things fit together a lot better. When you go with things according to Aristotle, it's not that Kant was wrong. In fact, we don't necessarily know if Kant was wrong, but it's a big ongoing debate in the field of metaphysics. And again, for the purpose of us thinking like a Christian and for constructing our own worldview, it seems to just make more sense to split things up into these 10 different categories, or you can argue that there's more or less categories. I'm fine with that. But splitting up reality into these different categories, that things actually exist in these different ways, and it's not so much dependent upon our own observations. Our observations, change how we understand the way that those things are. So, in short, when thinking about categories, go with Aristotle and not Kant. But let's, because in this case, we think Kant is wrong. You can't go with Kant. Don't do it.
I just have to bring a little levity.
No, it's good. So how does this practically work out for us? And practically might be a little bit of a loaded word there because none of this seems very practical. But let's think just for a moment about intention, right? This idea of intention. So next week we're going to talk about soul and mind and body and all those different things. But one of the most unique things about the mind is that the mind can occupy what people call mental states. Right. And we understand this on a very common level. A mental state is something that your mind is generally occupied with. It's something that you're generally thinking. You might even have said to somebody at some point, like, I'm just not in a good mental state, or I'm not in a good mental space. But all of those mental states, what makes those mental states different than things existing differently than your mind, is that mental states have what we call intention. That means that these mental states are about something else. So for example, if you're in a mental state of thinking about a vacation that you took 3 weeks ago, you might be, your mental state might be about thinking about your vacation. I might be pondering how Mia and I were riding roller coasters like 4 weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago. Wasn't that long ago. But that's a mental state about my summer vacation. And so this idea of intention, this aboutness that our mental states can have, trying to put this into a category so we can understand what intention really is. It's like asking the question of, okay, if intention is something that our mental states actually do have, is it a property of our mental states? Do our mental states have the property of somehow being about something, or is it a relation? Are our mental states somehow related to the thing that they are about, but it is not necessarily a property of our mind? And again, that's maybe a bit more of an impractical question, but it helps when we're dealing with big metaphysical questions to start to parse these things out and to say, okay, how does this thing exist? In what way does this thing exist? And so on. So that's general ontology. Again, very, very briefly, general ontology. The second area that metaphysics generally deals with is the area of special metaphysics. Special metaphysics is super easy. The word is right in the title. It deals with very special and specific cases. So it has two main concerns. It's generally dealing with specific topics of special interests. So questions like, is there a soul or a mind, or are we free or determined, would generally be considered special metaphysics. Special metaphysics also deals with classification and investigation of other fields of study. So things like biology or physics or sociology, or questions like that are generally brought into the metaphysics field under this category of special metaphysics. And I bring this up just to say that this category exists. It's not part of a general ontology, because general is like, here's the baseline groundwork for it, and then special is, now how do you take this baseline groundwork and apply it in these different situations? Again, there's not a test. You don't have to remember any of this. This is just trying to get our minds in a general way of thinking. And speaking of getting our minds in a general way of thinking, how does one do metaphysics? Like, how do we actually go about this? Is it just somebody who's sitting really, really hard and they have a moment where they sit down in a bathtub and the water rises? They go, Eureka, I found it. I have discovered a metaphysical question. Or is there like some process that we can do that brings us along as we think about doing this kind of thinking? And so there are four methods. Well, they're not really methods, because again, there's no really agreed upon method for doing metaphysics. People in philosophy can't agree on anything, which is why philosophy is so much fun. But rather, there's four general guidelines that are really good for thinking about doing metaphysics. And just one note before we get into these methods, one specific view about methodology and the way that you go about it will probably be dependent, at least in part, on your position to general philosophical questions. So for example, if you are a theist, if you believe that God exists, that there are, things outside of the material world, you are much more likely to approach metaphysics in a certain way as opposed to someone who is a naturalist. And a naturalist is a philosopher or a thinker who holds that reality is completely encaptured within space and time. And I think, as I've quoted Carl Sagan before, that matter is all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. And so these kind of people, they approach this metaphysics methods and these questions very, very differently. And again, it's just a matter of thinking about these things differently. So these are more guidelines than they are hard and fast rules, but it's a good way to start thinking about these kind of questions. So what are the methods? The first step, or the first guideline, is that we should begin asking metaphysical questions by taking into account the things we already know, or things we already have reason to believe are true, right? So this is why the first couple of weeks were really important, because we could just stop here and be like, well, how do we know that we know anything? Or how do we think that things are even true? We've talked about it. Go back and look at the last 2 weeks. But we should begin these kind of questions by, again, taking into account or taking into understanding things that we already know, or things that we have reason to believe, before having done any metaphysics work. And this is important because these kind of questions, they're an attempt to analyze, clarify, and account for these items of rational belief and try to make sense of them. So, for example, if we're thinking about an apple, right? We know that or we have very good reason to believe that the redness of an apple, and I'm not talking about Granny Smith apples, we're talking about a red apple. A red apple, that the redness of it is real, that somehow that property or quality of it is different than the sweetness of the apple, and that it is also the color of the apple's surface, right? Like those are common things that we know, and we can bring that kind of knowledge into metaphysics. And metaphysics tries to, for this, it tries to say like, well, duh, an apple, like I can see that the apple is red, and I know that the color is different from the taste of it. But metaphysics starts talking about those questions to say, okay, well, how do we know that those things are different? Like, how do those things exist? Like, they share the concept of existing, but somehow they're different. So it attempts to ask those kind of questions. The second method, the second thing that is very helpful in doing metaphysics is to state the metaphysical problem you are trying to solve and what gives rise to the problem. So this is common with problem solving, right? A lot of people say if you're going to solve any kind of problem, state your problem clearly. And metaphysics is not just state your problem clearly, but also state what gives rise to the problem. Like why is this some kind of problem that has to do with being? So for example, two roses seem to have the exact same smell. They smell exactly the same. How can each of these roses have the same smell? Does it mean that the specific smell is in both roses at the same time? And if that's the case, then how can something be in more than one thing at once? Or if each rose has its own smell, how are we to account for the fact that the smell seems to be the exact same in both roses? If we say that the smell of one exactly resembles the smell of the other, doesn't just mean that the roses resemble each other and that they have the same smell. And so it's questions asking, it's asking questions like these.
A rose by any of them.
Right. So it's asking the question, is that smell intrinsic to what it means to be a rose? And that is a metaphysical question. Or do roses just resemble each other in the way that they smell? Or do they have to? Guideline number 3 for doing metaphysics is it's very helpful to use thought experiments as sources for counterexamples to arguments. So using thought experiments is actually something that you probably do more than you realize. But when you start breaking it down, it becomes a very useful tool in doing metaphysics. And so with this one, I had Mia write the 3 ways that that we do these kind of thought experiments. So in these thought experiments, we want to say, okay, something in the actual world is the question that we're asking or that we're trying to wrap our minds around or that we're trying to experience. And so what we will do generally is we will propose in metaphysics, we'll propose some kind of possible world. So we'll say, if the world worked in this specific way, then would this thing be different? So for example, in the actual world, we know that elephants are gray, or there's some shade of gray, but in some possible world, elephants are pink, right? They just exist. They're pink elephants. They're walking around everywhere. Now, this possible world, it seems like it's something that, could have reasonably happened. There's nothing about being an elephant that necessitates it being gray. Like the elephant could have been a different color. That doesn't really change anything about its being an elephant. And so we say that elephants being pink, they exist in some possible world, but they probably don't exist in the actual world, right? And so we propose those kind of thought experiments. Or another kind of thought experiment that we can say is, if let's say we're trying to find an impossible world, is there something that we can think of that absolutely cannot exist, just flat out and outright cannot exist, period? And so we start thinking and we say, oh, okay, let's propose this. Let's say that there is a man and he is a married bachelor. Mm-hmm. And we're like, well, hold on just a second. If he's a married bachelor, then by the very definition of being married, he can't be a bachelor, because if he's married, that means he has a partner. But if he's a bachelor, that means that he is single. And so this person exists in the state of being both single and with a partner at the exact same time. and we start thinking, okay, that breaks the rule of logics, it breaks the rule of non-contradiction. You can't be two things that are opposite at the same time. And so we would say that a married bachelor can't exist. It is in an impossible world that a married bachelor exists. Or another example, this is one of my favorite examples. No one anywhere at any point in time can draw a square circle. It is a circle that is defined as a square. It is a circle that has 4 sides and 4 right angles, but it's a circle. So again, it's a complete impossibility because it's trying to be defined both as a square and as a circle at the exact same time. And so we would say again in this thought experiment that a square circle is an impossibility. It can't possibly exist. And so those are the kind of thought experiments that we do that really help with metaphysics. And in doing these kind of thought experiments, we get led to method or guideline number 4, which says that we're not constrained to work within the bounds of our sense experience, right? We go beyond empiricism. We go beyond being able, again, what we can just test or, what we can quantify with data, because in doing these thought experiments, again, we ask questions of, can there be a married bachelor? Well, you can't put marriage in one test tube and put bachelor in another test tube and compare the two, because those concepts, they don't exist inside of empirical data. And so we're not constrained by the bounds of strict empiricism, and it can be helpful sometimes to say, okay, am I too locked into this specific line of thinking, or can I break out of it in doing metaphysics? And I feel like this is a good time for a pause. Does anybody have questions or comments? Is everybody like, I'm super confused and I don't care what you're saying? I just want to leave it open for a brief second.
You like to joke years ago, David's brother said, if everybody thought like me, it'd be a better world. Which is, that's what the first thing I thought of. He said, actual world, impossible world. Or possible world, no.
All right, well, so since you guys don't have questions, and since we're like, okay, metaphysics, ontology, whatever, right? What do these things have to do with me and being a good Christian thinker? I titled this portion in my notes, Why Should I Care? Why do I care about thinking metaphysically or ontologically? Well, when we start thinking metaphysically and ontologically, there's a great monk who existed in the year 1077, and I know this date specifically because we're about to watch a video about it. He existed in the year 1077, and he was writing a defense. He was thinking about God's existence, and he's like, I have this understanding that, morals are probably rooted and grounded in God, and I have this understanding that the universe probably somehow had to come into existence from God, but I'm not satisfied with those two understandings. And so he started to think really, really hard, and he started to try and say, okay, if I can come up with, something that might not necessarily be easier, but something that is like self-contained, something that would just say, if people can just understand who God is, like by definition, then maybe it's possible that God just exists ontologically. And so we're going to watch a short video. It's like 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll discuss it a little bit, and I'll show you how the metaphysical methods, the guidelines that we used, apply inside of this video. We're going to watch a video that's called the ontological argument, and it was an argument that was first proposed by Saint Anselm, again in the year 1077. It's picked up by several thinkers somewhere along the line, somewhere in their history. It's a very polarizing argument. It's one of the ones where if you're talking with people about does God exist, you bring up the ontological argument, people are either going to be like, oh yeah, that's really solid, or they're going to laugh in your face, because it's very polarizing. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to watch this video. Mia, will you look on the portal and see there's a little slide thing on top? Does it close the camera first, or does it close the microphone first?
Mike.
It does do the mic first?
Yeah.
Okay. Bob, since you're the first person that's on the screen right in front of me, we're going to shut the mic off of this, and I'm going to turn the volume on the portal way down so I can play it on my computer, but you should be able to hear the video because I'm going to share it on Zoom. If you can't hear the video, like flag me down or something and we'll change it, okay? Okay. Thank you.
Oh wait, the switch works differently than I thought. I think it actually does the video first. Yeah, it does the camera first.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait. A maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor or a square circle or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
Just turn the podium around again quick. So, like I said, that's a video about what is commonly called the ontological argument. And if that's not an argument that you've heard of before, then welcome to your very first world, or your very first talk of what's commonly called Christian apologetics, which, as we defined at the very beginning of this class, is it's really just giving a defense of the Christian faith. No, I promise I'm going to have this system worked out better when we do a video next time. But the idea of apologetics is, again, it's giving a defense of the Christian faith. It's asking, are these things rational to believe? Are there arguments that we can say that are, that are good, that give us a defense or a reason for thinking this? And so the ontological argument is one that is given specifically. Now, whether or not you buy the ontological argument is not extremely what's at issue here. I hope that you buy it, because I think it's a really good argument, and it's driven me to some really good reflections recently. And not just recently, but over time, the more you think about it, the more it's like, oh, that's very interesting thinking about being. But I think that this argument, it's called the ontological argument because it deals in this realm of ontology, right? It studies what does it mean for something to be, and specifically, what does it mean for there to be a maximally great being? Like, is there something about a maximally great being that would necessitate not only its being this specific way, but its being, existing in all of these different ways? And so it argues basically just from the pure baseline existence that if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being has to exist.
So I have a question.
Okay.
So in that argument, the definitions of the maximally great being was, one of the definitions was morally perfect in all possible worlds.
Yes.
So I imagine that's an area that gets pushed back on a lot.
Yeah, so the video didn't get into it a ton, but the reason why that first premise, it's possible that a maximally great being exists, gets pushed back on so much is because people push back a lot on, what does it mean for you to actually have maximal power, right? Omnipotent. A lot of times what people argue is the question, if God is omnipotent, can he create a rock so heavy that even he can't lift it?
Yeah.
Or I have an atheist friend who once argued to me, he said, if God is omnipotent, then he could create a being that is stronger than himself because he's all powerful. He can do anything. And that falls under the definition, like anything is all things. That's just the way that it's defined. And so
Doesn't that, like Corey said, so if there was a greater maximal.
Right, so if there's a being that was found to be greater than what we consider God, then this would stop being God and that thing would be God.
Yeah.
In our understanding. But the idea of a maximally great being says that there's some sort of like limit right? So if this is the scale of power, the scale of morality, it says that at some point you reach some finite limit of what it means to be morally, like maximally morally great or maximally powerful, right? And so it says that there's some kind of maximal amount that it can be. And now this, I know, gets a lot of pushback from people because people will say, oh, well, God's power is infinite. It has no limit. And generally, I like to say that is a way that we have chosen to define something with a very unfortunate word, because I would say that it's quantitatively or qualitatively infinite, not quantitatively infinite. So, for example, God, there are certain things that God cannot create, like a square circle, right? Because if God could create a square circle, then the world is not actually governed by rules of logic and rationality. So if God can create a square circle, then our beef with there being a being that's maximally powerful and can do whatever he wants just gets thrown out the window, because there are no logical rules that govern things. But if there is some kind of rule or law of logic that helps to govern things, then we have to say, okay, there's some kind of limit or there's some kind of master end to there being a maximally great being. And again, this is a question of ontology, right? We're asking these kind of questions, or we're proposing these in a possible world. Is it possible that God could create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it, as an example?
But doesn't that start to get back into that square circle? Or I can't remember what he called it.
Logically incoherent.
Yeah. That seems, that argument of could God create a more powerful being himself or a rock he can't lift, and that
Right.
That feels to me like a logically incoherent.
That's
Yes.
Like saying, like God's already has infinite power. How could there be more than infinite power?
Right. Or, can God create a machine that will double his power? And in that case, based on the laws of mathematics, you could technically say yes, because double of infinity is still infinity. But that's calculus you don't need to worry about. So
The Bible says that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So, right?
It says Jesus Christ is.
Well, Jesus Christ is God, but
It's
he's the same. He's always the same. So that's kind of one of the laws of that God can't break.
right, but so with that verse specifically, it's a question of what do you mean by God is the same? That God relates to his people in the same way, or that, God exists in one state unchangeably throughout all time? Because a lot of people will go for the latter option, will say God exists in one specific state unchangeably throughout time, and so God ends up becoming this like perfect statue of a being that we somehow have a relationship with, but that is unchangeable.
And yet it says also that he changed his mind.
Right. And it says several times that God changes his mind, or that, God is consumed in his own heart and repents.
But if you talk about the concept of change, you talk about time.
Right.
And God does not dwell in time.
And see, I would
So how
disagree
can
with
he change
that.
his mind?
I would disagree. I would say that God does dwell in time. And
Uh,
that's what we're going to get into, not next week. It's in 3 weeks. We're going to talk about the philosophy of time and space. And I'm going to make an argument for why I think that God can't exist outside of time, but that God, after having created time, has to enter into it.
I think he can enter
did.
into it, but I think he can go out of it just like he goes into it.
And see, I think that means that either we don't understand time properly, or I just think that means that we would have to not understand time properly. But the way that we understand it, I don't think that's
Well,
possible.
It's the argument we were just making about if God could create a more powerful being than himself.
Right. I would say that's a logically incoherent statement.
Yes, but he defines what is all powerful. So how could it be more than what he is?
Right. Because it's a logically incoherent statement, is what I'm saying. And in the same way, I would say that God existing outside of time is a logically incoherent statement, for reasons I won't get into now, but we will get there. Because of the way that I think that time has to work. Like I said, we'll get there. So save that question, because I promise you in 3 weeks we'll get to it. And it's a fun discussion. I had it with Mia's parents when we were on vacation a few weeks ago. I used my pastoral questions, and they brought up God existing outside of time, and I'm like, oh really? God exists outside of time. Let's talk about that. So we'll get there. But the point for ontology, for ontological argument right now, is this idea of a maximally great being existing, right? And so this is this ontological question that we're starting to ask ourselves. Is it possible that a maximally great being exists? And if a maximally great being does exist, what are the things that a maximally great being, would exhibit? Right? So a maximally great being would exhibit power. This being would be unable to be defeated by any other being, because if this being could be defeated by another being, then it would not be maximally great in this area. This being must be morally perfect, right? Because if there was some kind of moral shortcoming that some other being could somehow do morally better in an area, then this being would not be maximally great in the area of morality. And so this also assumes that, there are things like objective moral values and duties.
That's what I was.
Right. And but this is where people start to push on this, and this is why it's so divisive, because that first premise says that just in the idea of a maximally great being existing, like, is it even possible that this kind of being exists?
Is there a moral law apart from God?
I would say no. There's not. And we'll get into that in 6 weeks. It's one right after time and space. We're going to get into that.
I think then morality in a way is what also makes us different than the animals.
Yeah. Is one of the things.
It's a defining human trait.
Right. And so what we would say that as a being, we are, in moral senses, we are greater than the animals, morally speaking, because animals don't have a sense of moral values and duties. They don't hold to any sort of morality that we have. But if we hold that objective moral values and duties exist, that there are actually things that are right and wrong to do. And again, we're going to talk about all this in a few weeks. But if we hold to that, then we say, the closer that we conform to, the closer that we hold to these things that are right and that are wrong to do, there's a way to be morally better than other actions, or than other beings who don't necessarily do those actions. And that's not an invitation for you to start judging people that don't do the same moral actions that you do. It's a general philosophical statement. So this idea of it's possible that a maximally great being exists, it's that question of ontology. But when you start moving through the rest of the argument, right, then we get into even more than just a possible world. Is it possible a maximally great being exists? Because if it is possible, then this maximally great being would exist in some possible world. Like we're just granting, for the sake of argument right now, that premise one is true, that a maximally great being can exist. It's possible. And so if a maximally great being can exist in some possible world, its possibility, then that maximally great being would have to exist in every possible world, because a maximally great being that existed in one possible world but not another, and was trumped by a being that could exist in this world and this world and this world, would not be a maximally great being, because there's a being that can exist in more possible worlds than this other being. And so a maximally great being, if it exists in some possible world, it has to exist in every possible
Or
world.
if there's a possible world where a maximally great being can't exist.
So is there a world where, is there a possible world where a maximally great being doesn't exist?
Right.
I would say no,
Would be
because
the
this
other
being is
argument,
maximally great.
Just because. Yeah.
Right. So,
But so, I mean, as a different argument to, if a maximally great being exists in one possible world, but not another, because a more maximally great being exists in that possible world. Or if it was a world where a maximally possible being couldn't exist at all, then that would also mean it's not a maximally great being.
yes.
Because it would have to exist in all possible worlds.
Right. Because in order to be one of the great making qualities of a being is its existence in possible worlds. right? So this is one of the things about the pizza, right, that can't be maximally great. So maximally great pizza, if we put aside just all of the taste things for a second, a pizza can't exist in a world where only a simple consciousness exists. So there's a philosophical idea. It was by a guy.
I like the idea of a
Maximally great being.
pizza.
Yeah.
Pizza.
I do too. If you want a maximally great pizza, go to 312 in Germantown. Phenomenal. That's beside the point. But there's a philosopher whose name was you're going to be a theologian. His name was Boltzmann with a B. And he argued that if there's a state of existence that is to be the most simple, like if we were to look out into the universe and say, why is everything so complex? Shouldn't it be a lot more simple? That the simplest state of existence is literally just like a single consciousness, or sometimes called a Boltzmann brain. It's just a brain existing in
Or a
space.
consciousness.
Yeah, or a consciousness. Right, a brain is substituted here for consciousness, but it's just a simple consciousness existing in space. But because a simple consciousness existing in space is not the same thing as a pizza, it's impossible for a pizza to exist in this kind of possible world where nothing except a single consciousness exists.
But you couldn't go there either.
Well, but see, we could imagine a world in which a unicorn probably couldn't exist in that world. You're right. So a unicorn, not a maximally great being, because if a unicorn were to exist in this space of singular consciousness, the simplest state of being, one, the unicorn would run out of air, not be able to physically sustain itself. So the unicorn would die and probably cease existing.
You're assuming that the unicorn needs it.
Yes. So because unicorns are horses and horses generally breathe air, I am assuming that unicorns need air.
Unicorns. They're magic.
They're magic unicorns.
They live on rainbows.
Live on rainbows and sunshine. So again, if maximally great being, if it exists in every possible world, then the actual world is a possible
So-
world because we exist in this world. So we think of it as
So the maximally great being can exist in the possible world of simple consciousness.
yes. So maximally great being is a being that has no material component to it, that exists completely and totally as an unattached consciousness. And because it has no matter, it is not bound to the spatio-temporal world.
It might be the consciousness that's in the world that only has consciousness.
Right. Well, it
So
would
it
it would
could
it
exist.
would be. That's the only thing that exists there, because that's the simplest form of existing. But because it has no matter, it's not bound to it necessarily. So it can exist there. It can exist inside of it. It can exist apart from it even, but it is also able to exist in it, just by itself. And so the idea of consciousness, and this is why things like numbers become really interesting, because numbers as an abstract object, if they exist, also exist without some kind of connection to matter or without some kind of connection to time necessarily. And so it's a question of, do numbers exist? And I don't know that we're going to get into that. I don't believe that numbers exist somewhere. I think they're representative of the relationship between things quantitatively. But if you talk to a Platonist, somebody who follows Plato, Plato believed that Plato believed that a lot of things existed. He believed that there was an idea of justice that existed, that the perfect justice is out there somewhere. And this is called Plato's, I want to say it's his cave analogy. But he said that there's a perfect ideal of something out there somewhere, and everything that we experience in the physical world is a shadow of that perfect thing. And so like the chair that you're sitting in is a shadow, or it's a reflection of the most perfect chair that exists somewhere out there. Or the perfect concept of chair that you're sitting in. And that was Plato's thought. But again, that's probably a little further than we go. Okay, we went on a little bit of a bunny trail there. Does anybody have questions about metaphysics, ontology, the ontological argument? Again, hang on to your questions about time and morality, because we will get to those, and I will make arguments both for the idea that God created time and then entered into it, and also for the idea that morality is rooted and grounded in the being of God, but that's in several weeks. So hang on to those.
So how does Genesis start in the beginning?
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
And then John says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was
The Word was
God.
with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and there's nothing that was brought into being that was not, or all things were brought into being through him, and without him there was nothing that was brought into being that is now in being, more or less.
That sounds pretty metaphysical.
It is. That's it. Those are super metaphysical ideas, thinking about that. So any other questions or comments? We're done a little bit earlier today, but like I said, this is dense. Ontology is really dense, and next week might be a little more interesting just because it's something I feel like people have a stake in. But we're going to ask the question of mind and body, or to put it in a different way, we're going to ask the question of, do we have a soul? What does it mean to have personal identity after death? But I think that before you take that step into, do we have a soul, and asking this special metaphysics question, it's important for us to just get a general understanding of, first we have to ask these kind of very basic questions. What does it mean to be? What does it mean to exist? And if we say that, somehow personal identity exists after death or persists after death, then we have to say, okay, how does me existing in that state both conform and differ from the state that I exist in right now? And how do they share in existence as well? Because if we say that we exist after death, but I also exist right now, they have to share some kind of commonality, but they also differ in some ways. And so we will ask the soul question next week. And the week after that is free will and determinism, and then time and space, and then ethics and morality. And why should I be moral? Because I said so. That's what my parents would have said when I was a young kid. Cool. So any questions? Comments? Concerns?
I have a
Like I said-
question.
Yes. Hi, Emily. I didn't even know you were here.
Hi. I've just had my video down. Okay. I just have a quick question.
There are no quick questions in philosophy.
Right. Okay. Thanks. That's true. So 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we were talking about knowledge and how do you know something?
Yes.
And I can't remember the exact words that we used, but I know that evidence was a big part of that. Being able to have some kind of, I think you said earlier, empirical evidence. And so when we're playing around with words and logical things like this argument that we've been talking about, is it knowledge?
Yeah, so this is a great question, because one of the small jumps that we made 2 weeks ago when we talked about knowledge, one of the things we talked about was, what's the difference between having knowledge and having a justified belief, right? And the difference is some kind of truth-making property that takes something from just a justified belief to knowledge. And we generally said, okay, it's some kind of truth that depends on some kind of evidence that we have for it. And so when you make the jump into metaphysics, this is why one of the first methods and one of the first guidelines for doing metaphysics is take what you already know, or take what you already have justified belief to have, and bring that into metaphysics. And then we can start playing with, playing with the ideas about, what we have and what we don't have, or, what we think is actually the case and what we think is actually not the case. And so the evidence part comes into even just that precursory idea of, do we have knowledge, or is this more a justified belief? And again, if we say we have a justified belief, we can probably say, I'm reasonable in saying that I have this piece of knowledge until there's a defeater that comes along for me saying otherwise. So when you take that and now you apply it to the case of the ontological argument. So we take the entire field of ontology and we say, okay, I'm reasonably certain I have a justified belief that God exists based on the ontological argument. If somebody presents me a defeater for that, for example, a maximally great being can't exist, so the ontological argument fails. If somebody could provide a defeater for that, then I would say, okay, I can no longer say that I have any kind of knowledge or even justified belief in holding on to this argument, because I was presented with a defeater for it, unless I come up with a defeater for the defeater. So it all kind of loops back around in on itself, and where the ontological argument goes into asking a greater question of, does God exist, right? And so we're focused on the big question of, is G here? So we go into ontology and we start dipping into that, and we come back around and we say, okay, we're asking now another question, does God exist? And one of the pieces of evidence that we have for this justified belief that God exists is to say, well, I have this argument that led me down the philology about possible great being exists, and because this one piece of evidence seemed to work out really well, I'm going to call it O. Because O led me to a justified belief in God, I could say, reasonably, I could say, yeah, I have knowledge that God exists until somebody presents me with a defeater for that. But then we say, okay, well, what happens if somebody does present me with a defeater? What happens if O goes away? Right? Oh no, the idea of a maximally great being can't exist, or we have to rework it, and so we're stuck in figuring out something else. Well, fortunately, there are a lot of other evidences or pieces for talking about God's existence. So we have things like the teleological argument, or cosmological argument, or the moral argument, or personal experience. Right? And so we have all of these things that also add to it. And so we have these multiple pieces of evidences that go towards our knowledge or to our justified belief that God exists. And so if one gets knocked off, we still have 4 or 5 other ones. And this is actually something that we're going to cover if we decide we want to do the problem of evil the very last week. And I really hope that we do, because the problem of evil is fun to think about philosophically, and I think it's a really good tool to have. But the problem of evil talks about God in the same way. It's like, if God is perfectly good, what do we do with the existence of evil? Right? Does evil point us to God? Does evil point us away from a loving God? What do we do with that? And one of the arguments made there is you can look at evil specifically in one of its contained units, but if you start looking at it in bigger and surrounded by more and different evidences, it starts to take a slightly different shape. And so, yeah, we start thinking about things differently depending on what evidence we have, how strong or weak the evidence is, and in talking about knowledge and justified belief and how those two are related. That felt like a really long answer to your question. Was that was that okay? Awesome.
It's good. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments or anything of the like?
When you started doing those little circles of different things, I thought, okay, so I'm still okay that I don't know any philosophy because I do have personal experience. I do have whatever some of those other things I probably have.
Yeah. Well, and like I briefly mentioned last week, we didn't get the chance to get into it, but the religious epistemology, the religious way that we learn about God through what is commonly called revelation, but is also sometimes known as personal experience. There are philosophical arguments that personal experience or revelation is a good source of information, of knowledge even, or justified belief about the existence of God. It's not a surefire guaranteed way. And again, it's not something that you can go to somebody else and say, I've had this experience, and so now you must believe everything that I say. Because a personal experience works, for me, it helps me determine what is true and what is not true. But if I'm going to go to everybody else, I need to appeal to, the shared experience that we have, reality. But yeah, personal experience is a really good
Hello.
thing, so. Hi, Bob.
Sorry.
That's okay. All right. So with that,
Somebody called me.
oh, you're good. So like I said, that's all that we have for this week. Thank y'all for being here. I know again it was
really here.
yes, you were really here. This was real. You were real. I am real. The world that we're experiencing around us is
We're in
real.
time.
If you don't think it is, provide me with a defeater for that belief. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Like I said, next week we'll talk about, do we have a soul? So bring your soul related questions.
I'm a soul man, therefore.
Soul man. Maybe watch the Pixar movie Soul in preparation. It's actually, that movie raises some good questions that we'll think about because, you have, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's Joe. He's a guy, he's a jazz musician. And after he dies, he retains his entire identity after death. And so it's actually really good question of when we die, do we retain that kind of identity after we die?
Also The Good Place.
Also, The Good Place was really good. That had a lot of good philosophical
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
So there's lots of good philosophy stuff out there, and you are becoming well equipped to deal with all of them because you're amazing Christian thinkers and you do good work. So yeah, thanks for being here. We'll see y'all next week. If you have questions or anything else, please feel free to let me know. Yeah, we'll see you then.
There was something you said at the very beginning about why is this person different than that? What makes it like, all of a sudden I thought about Veggie Tales.